Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you are allowing your faith to shape your politics or are your politics starting to shape your faith. In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orland Johnson, and let me introduce you to our roundtable of regularly scheduled panelists. We have with us today Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. We also have with us Ms. Carmela Monk Crawford, that's the editor of Message Magazine. We have Melissa Reed, who's the Washington liaison for the North American Division of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And we also have Ms. Jennifer Woods, Director of Government Affairs for the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ladies, thank you very much, and thank you for being here with us today. Let's go on to segment one. Segment one is talking about a piece of legislation that actually did not make it, the Religious Liberty Protection Act of 1999. 1 year later, they ended up creating that relationship or piece of legislation that we would call RLUIPA. However, what ended up happening in 1999, much of the information that got carved out, 30 years later, looks like a lot of those activities in terms of giving states power and things of that nature seem to be coming back into play again. So the question really is, are we going to see a new version of this 1999 that we thought would never pass, or will we just see an augmentation of RLUIPA? Jennifer, just give us a little bit of background on this and let me know how we think we may be moving forward.
Sure. So this Religious Liberty Protection Act of 1999, what it would do is it would protect religious activities and practices from being substantially burdened by the government unless it was the least restrictive means of fulfilling the compelling government interest. And actually it was brought up as an act or as legislation in response to a 1997 case by the Supreme Court that found RFRA to be unconstitutional as applied to the state and local governments. And that case was the city of Bourne versus Flores. And so what as you said, parts of this act of 1999 were codified and into law as RLUIPA, but then parts of it just fell away. And so what we ended up having instead is individual states, some of them have RFRA provisions, some of them don't. And I think it'll be interesting to see if we end up having, again, RFRA on the federal level applying to the states, because that does seem to be the direction in which we're going.
And I got to tell you, Bettina, this is exactly what the question is in my mind. We see so many nuanced activities that are happening as it relates to religious liberty. This past session of the Supreme Court, you could almost call it the religious freedom court opportunities. And so when we see that, we think that there's something that may have existed 30 years ago that we never thought we would possibly see right now. Is there a possibility we may be going back to the future again as it relates to this type of concepts?
You know, such an interesting question, Orland. You know, and as Jennifer so clearly put it in a historical context, you know, this piece of legislation was part of this fervor at the time in the late 1990s to try to remedy what was seen as this sort of breach of religious freedom standards, that people were trying to pass legislation that would really restore what they saw as the Supreme Court's destruction of religious freedom standards or protections in the Smith decision, in the 1990 Smith decision. But here's the thing. Strangely enough, back in 1999, I was a young person in Washington working for an advocacy organization that was actually working on this legislation. And when we went to advocacy meetings to talk about getting this legislation passed, you would see sitting around the table members of the ACLU, you would see far right, far left, and everyone in between coming together because we believed that religious freedom was worth protecting and worth protecting strongly. Today, we are in a profoundly different environment where there is a split between left and right. And for that reason, I personally would find it I don't know, I'd be surprised if all the groups could come together and get that sort of legislative momentum going around beefing up religious freedom protection at the federal level.
Yeah, Orland, if I could just jump in, do you mind? What Bettina said is just absolutely resonates. You know, as somebody that's working on Capitol Hill, trying to pass religious freedom legislation now with a coalition of other good faith actors, I am envious of the broad coalition of support for religious protections that the 1990s had. You mentioned RLUIPA and sort of, the Religious Liberty Protection Act led to RLUIPA. That was passed unanimously by Congress. I mean, that's just unfortunately unheard of now. And by the way, this was not, I don't think that members of Congress were overzealous. RLUIPA, for example, has been very beneficial to the Seventh-day Adventist Church as far as, zoning issues for our local congregations. So unfortunately, I wish that we were headed in that direction, but I have to agree with Bettina. I don't think that we are.
Carmela, there's a struggle that seems to be going on everywhere. Any decision that needs to be made, you got a left side, you got a right side. It's a red state or it's a blue state. And the idea that we could ever come to the same understanding as it relates to a lot of these activities from a religious freedom standpoint seems to be fleeting. But the fact of the matter is that if we can't all come together, we're going to find ourselves dealing with this confederation of states, which in the long run is still just going to re-emphasize the red state, blue state concept. Am I missing something here, or do you see anything similar to that?
I see something similar to that, but I think, I also resonate with what Bettina and Melissa have both said, that as we look at this issue and we look at the history, the landscape is so different. And you see the drumbeat and the people leading the charge for religious freedom and protections. So many, or the perception in the culture is that the people who are leading these charge have a perceived a grievance or a perceived encroachment upon their liberties, which, before you could really pinpoint what is it that has changed that made us react and try to respond in a way to protect. And because you had that reversal or the changes in the court case with Smith, and then you had the RFRA and everything like this, people were trying to come together to put some structure to the house. Now you see people saying, I'm fearful, I'm worried about things that are happening, and you really cannot measure this encroachment that is perceived out there. And so, yes, there's the hodgepodge from a state's perspective, but also the cultural, religious landscape is so different now. I don't see how people are going to come together.
Well, Bettina, let me ask you this, as somebody who was there back in that time when that was happening. It seems like the primary focus right now is that if I decide that I want to work together with anyone, I can't never win a primary. And if I can't win a primary, I'll never be able to be part of the real decision making. I mean, has the politics of today gotten so out of control that the idea of even thinking that your job is to work together is almost completely passé now?
Yeah, well, I think you've really identified a problem. We are in a toxic environment when it comes to discussing issues of religious freedom, because as Carmela so clearly pointed out, you have one group who says religious freedom is being used as a cover for discrimination. You have another group saying religious freedom is under threat. We need to assert our rights, and never the twain shall meet in this particular context. But can I just say, there is hope. There was a recent passage of the Uyghur Protection Act, where you had both parties coming together to say, in the international arena, we don't want to support the persecution and repression of a religious minority in China by allowing goods manufactured by forced labor in China to be imported to the US. I mean, so you are getting some sort of working together, some sort of cooperation on international issues. When it comes to domestic issues, we've got a long way to go.
Wow. Well, listen, thank you for that conversation, and I think you're right on point with that, Bettina. Let's go to our next segment. This is another issue that I found quite fascinating. I was doing some reading and I saw that there were certain religious groups that decided that they wanted to actually start to put some limitations on the whole concept of organ transplantation. In other words, they were under the impression that if they decided to donate their organs, that they wanted to have a specific, connection to who may end up with it. So someone who may be religious may say, if the person's atheist, I'd rather have them not have it. Or if somebody's of the Jewish persuasion, they only want their organs to go to other Jews. And we have two groups that are starting to push this agenda. Is this something that is way off base that we all need to really pump the brakes and say, wait a moment? And the bigger question is, once you donate an organ, do you actually own it to be able to have any say over it? Bettina, why don't you tell me what your thoughts are on that and how fascinating you may even find this to be?
Well, let me tell you, Orlin, I think that the whole area of organ transplants is just such a fraught area of healthcare, ethics, and law. And you sort of get this unholy mix around what is a very, very sensitive issue. There are so many moving parts here. The US Senate recently issued a report on some of the flaws in our current system, that there's not enough oversight, that people have actually died, people have developed diseases because the process there's not been a systematic, legally overseen process that makes sure that what needs to happen happens. But my understanding is that unless you're doing a living donation where you are actually donating an organ to an individual who who needs it, that those organs go to organ procurement organizations, which are non-profit organizations that work in conjunction with healthcare organizations who care for a waiting list of those who are on a list to receive certain organs. And so my understanding is that there is no legal path by which someone of a particular faith can say, no, I only want my organ to go to another person of a particular faith, unless you're making a living donation. That is my understanding. Of course, Orlin, you've raised a bigger ethical question. Should we even want to do that? I don't think so.
Well, Carmela, I got to ask you, the idea that I might decide as an African-American gentleman that if something happens that I'd like my organs to go to another African-American, or I'd like my organs to go to somebody of the same religion, is that really off base? I mean, shouldn't I be allowed to decide what I might want to do? Or am I now starting to create some issues that may end up causing bigger problems, as if our society doesn't have enough problems already?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry to smile at this inopportune moment. This is a very serious discussion about organ and donation. And as I looked into this, I think it's very interesting. Most religions, all religions, think that this is a great unselfish act. This is the one thing that you can do. You can't hope to ask for something in return. If you deliver or you donate your organ upon death, you're not getting anything in return. It's unselfish, an unselfish act. Here we are injecting into what is almost universally accepted as an unselfish kind of transaction, and putting now preferences and restrictions and ideas. This is the wrong way to go. And I just wish that we could rewind the clock on these kinds of discussions. I can understand where you would want to perhaps advantage someone who may come down on the list and may not have opportunities. Perhaps that is a different way or a different question to address and provide safeguards for. But by and large, I believe that, once you do this, and I'm encouraging everyone who's watching right now, go ahead, make sure they have whole organ donation Sabbath. Make sure you come inside and make that designation right now. Let your family know it's the right thing to do. But unless you're doing a living donation, such as a kidney to someone that you know that needs it, I think you let it go at that.
Melissa, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I really appreciated Carmela's point there about a large number of faith traditions, all the way from Catholic to Baptist to Muslim to Jewish to Sikh, all have actually issued statements supporting organ donation and transplantation. I was actually surprised at both the breadth and the amount of the diversity and the quantity of faith traditions that have issued statements, first of all. And second of all the statements that I saw were consistently positive. Again, highlighting what Carmela mentioned as far as, putting the needs of others before ourselves, and really the charitable spirit that goes along with, with this sort of selfless act. As a Christian, I think, it just resonates so much. And I second Carmela's call that, if there's an opportunity, as Bettina said, there certainly is a need for us to participate if we are able. And so, I was very pleasantly surprised both to see the number of faith traditions that had spoken out on the issue and just that it was universally positive.
Well, things that I found kind of interesting is that it was probably more the Orthodox Jews and also a group that's called the Islamic ulemas that were actually starting to raise these topics. And apparently there are also a few Asian religions that may have some different viewpoints regarding life after death and things of that nature. But the real question is, Jennifer, if it turns out that this now becomes part of my quote unquote religious beliefs, and we now know that people can craft religious beliefs and connotations under any stretch of the imagination, and if I'm in a society where I'm supposed to be protecting one's religious beliefs, if it's not going to create any undue hardship, is it off base for a religious group that says this is part of our beliefs as we've moved forward to not really allow them to have what they're looking for?
Well, I think that there actually is a compelling government interest to make sure that organ donation and organ recipients are based on medical need as defined by the bodies that handle that, such as UNOS. Because otherwise, if we allow people to direct where their organs are going to be sent, of course, we're not talking about, again, the living transplants like with kidney. In fact, I donated one last year to a friend of mine. I got to dictate exactly who it went to. She, and we worked together on that. But absent that, it needs to go to medical need. Otherwise, individuals who actually need the organ first aren't going to get it. And individuals who might be very low on the waiting list and not have the need might be the ones that benefit. So I think that there actually would be a compelling government interest as to why this kind of religious accommodation would be denied.
Bettina, I'm going to give you the last word on this. One of the other dynamics of what they were putting forward with their argument was that they liked the idea of it going to individuals in certain socioeconomic conditions or had circumstances in which they were of a lesser ability sometimes to be able to move the needle as it relates to these type of lists. Does that have any resemblance of anything that makes any sense from your perspective?
I'm afraid I agree entirely with Jennifer's analysis there. There is a compelling government interest to make sure that this process is administered according to objective and clear and fair criteria. And I think an attempt by a religious entity to dictate to that level, I think it reflects poorly on their willingness to be to affirm life and to be generous. But I think more importantly, as a matter of law, I think the government should support a more objective approach.
Well, thank you, and we'll let be the last word on that. Let's go on to our next item on our next segment. I wanted to talk about a case that was called Tanzin versus Tanvir. This is one of those instances where the justices at the time only had 8 that were actually serving, and they came to a unanimous decision regarding a case that was involving Muslim men who were placed on an FBI no-fly list. Jennifer, could you give us a little bit of the background on what that case was all about and what the idea that the courts were with this, under the nuance that we hardly ever see unanimous opinions and never see unanimous opinions usually as it relates to religious issues?
Sure. So to give the background of this case, this is after 9/11, and 3 Muslim men were approached by the FBI to basically be informants on the Muslim community. And when they refused to comply, they were placed on a no-fly list. And even though they reached out to TSA to try to get their names off of the list repeatedly, they were denied every time. And so this ended up with wasted plane tickets, them not being able to visit their family or travel freely. And what is really remarkable about this case is that, yes, it was a unanimous decision. It was one that was written by Clarence Thomas of all the justices. And it said that RFRA would allow for monetary damages in this case. It's not just injunctive relief. Because of wasted money on plane tickets, effective relief had to be damages, not just an injunction. And so that makes this case very, it makes it a unique case, and it sets a precedent that RFRA, you can get monetary damages as one of your remedies.
You know, Bettina, I was so shocked to see that monetary damages came into this, which I believe is the first time that the Supreme Court has connected this in this way. And I was even more surprised to see that it was a case regarding Muslims who always seem to be put in the most disparaging roles, and a lot of the decisions have gone against them. You know, what would you find unique about this that would cause all of the justices, including one of the most conservative, Clarence Thomas, to actually be writing the actual opinion on this?
Well, I think in essence, the reality is that religious freedom claims of this nature are cross-cutting. They cross all faith communities. They're interlinked. So an anti-religion precedent in a Christian case is going to be later applied in a Muslim case. A positive religious freedom precedent in a Muslim case is going to be applied in a Christian case later. And I think the Supreme Court saw that interlink. And so you also saw with this case, Orlin, a number of very conservative Christian organizations supporting the Muslim plaintiffs. And that, I think, also reinforces the idea that religious freedom principles aren't for one group or another. Once you have a strong and broad religious freedom principle, it protects everyone.
Carmela, it almost seems like we should be heartened by the fact that we looked at a Supreme Court that supposedly always talks about who's on the left and who's on the right, actually came to the conclusion that maybe this is something that it shouldn't matter whether you're person or religion or anything along those lines. Was there something that you felt that was positive at a level that was almost even shocking from this decision as you kind of had a chance to take a look at it?
Orlin, why do you ask me like that? Because my question, I'm wondering, how is it now we can recognize a damage claim here under this case when so many civil rights organizations have been asking for damage claims based on the actions of federal agents, actors, and operatives and all of that? I'm glad you're right. This levels the playing field. Let's see what happens as it applies to other cases where damages and monetary damages are being asked for and claimed because of damages that are more than a missed plane ticket. I'm glad, don't misunderstand me. I think that it was the right thing to do. I just want to see how it applies for other people.
You know, Melissa, as someone who's fighting for these type of issues for the protection of all religious groups, when you see a decision like this, what does it tell you?
Sure. Well, as a representative of a minority faith tradition, I'm absolutely heartened to see a unanimous decision on behalf of the individuals that have really been, discriminated against pretty egregiously. I was also heartened to see, I looked up and in fact, my faith tradition, the Seventh-day Adventist Church, submitted an amicus brief in support of the respondents and really highlighted the religious liberty protections or the robust protections that the Religious Freedom Restoration Act has, and how monetary damages were appropriate, quote unquote, appropriate relief against those who had harmed them. So I was heartened to see that our church had spoken in that way.
You know, Jennifer, I'd like to get your thoughts on this idea. We have so many people that are always talking about a justice gets into position. They are, quote unquote, a liberal justice or a conservative justice. But in many decisions that we see, every now and then you'll see what's considered to be a conservative justice voting on the other side, per se. Are we getting a little bit too caught up in the fact that when someone gets put in a position from a lifetime standpoint, that we really know what they're going to turn out to be? Justice David Souter was supposed to be one of the most conservative justices when he first came on the court, ended up probably voting more on the liberal side than any other person. Are we taking this too far because of the fact that you have a lifetime appointment? We really don't know where these people may end up. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's exactly right. And I think that also, taking something, just using one word to identify an entire person and how they're going to come out on a myriad of issues is just, it's an injustice to the individuals who sit on the bench. So, there may be justices that we label as more conservative and more liberal, but that doesn't mean that doesn't give their whole life background, and that doesn't give the whole of the person that's going to be issuing these opinions. And also in this case, we can see that justices can come down and say, okay, this is such a clear-cut and egregious incident, that we don't have to rule on conservative versus liberal. This is an issue of justice. This is an issue of looking at the law and what restitution under the law would actually entail, and what adequate relief should look like. And so we can't just look at a justice and say, oh, well, they're conservative, so they're going to rule this way, or they're liberal, they're going to rule this way, especially because they're on the bench for 10, 20, sometimes 30 more years. And they can change their opinion and their views on things.
And I think that's an important point. Does somebody have a comment they were getting ready to make? Carmela, we getting ready to say something?
No, I was just going to say you have to look at the facts of this case to see how egregious it really was. And you would hope that someone would say, forcing someone to be an informant in a faith community, and if they don't comply, if I have the facts right to this, if they don't comply, now you are punishing them for their lack of compliance. You would hope that someone would recognize that as an egregious abrogation of their rights, and they should be compensated for that, redressed for that. I think that this also signals, they had the recent case, is it FBI? Don't we see something coming down the pike with respect to Muslims and informants in the community as well? I think,
Absolutely.
The court is open to looking at how we are treating people, especially of quote unquote minority religions in our country. What are we willing to do? How far are we going to go in our pursuit of certain ideals and aims? And how many people are we going to run over as we do that? I think this is a good sign in some ways.
I think it is as well, and I'm going to let that be the last word on this topic. But hopefully, by the grace of God, we will end up seeing more and more activities where people can be more confident that the right thing is always going to be done. All right, well, let's wrap this thing up. Melissa, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, Orland. So I heard Carmela sort of allude to this just briefly, but I'm still going to use it as my fact for you today. So the organ transplant advocacy organization known as Donate Life America hosts an awareness campaign known as National Donor Sabbath. And basically, this organization partners with faith leaders to educate the public about both the critical need for organ donations and also to celebrate life and pray for those who have been affected by organ donation and transplantation. So you heard it from Carmela and I first, National Donor Sabbath.
Wow. Carmela, tell me something I don't know.
Once again, Orland, you know so much. I don't think I can meet that bar, but I will say that Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, many people sort of maybe, like you said earlier, maybe people profiled her. Maybe she's liberal to moderate. I think she is her own person, having lived a life of a well thought out and well balanced life. She's being thoughtful, and no, we can't pigeonhole her. That may be surprising to some.
Wow. Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, I guess Melissa and I were thinking on the same path. So I wanted to bring up that April of each year is National Donate Life Month to raise awareness about donation and encouraging people to register as an organ, eye, or a tissue donor. And you can go to organdonor.gov for more information if you're interested. And I encourage everyone to register.
Great. Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
So I'm going off topic and off this continent to Sweden, often considered the most liberal of the European countries. It is the latest casualty in the rise of religious nationalism. Most recent elections, the Sweden Democrats won 20% of the vote. They're going to be controlling the country's governing coalition. Despite their name, they have direct historical roots to fascism, to white nationalism. They consider Christianity a marker of Swedish culture. Christian nationalism is on the rise today around the world.
Wow. Well, I want to thank you ladies for being with us today, and that was a great conversation that we had. And I'd also like to thank our audience for being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. And just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.